Okay, I think we're just going to get started now. We're still waiting on one more of our panelists to join us, but I think he will join no doubt, just as soon as we start speaking. Just to kick off, hi everyone, I'm Martin Nolan from Skyscanner, and on behalf of Skyscanner and our team of panelists today, I'm pleased to welcome everyone who's taken the time out to join us for our webinar, Travel Confident. This is part of our series of webinars that aim to take a deep dive into the issues that really matter to you, our travellers, in today's new and changing world of travel. Along with our panelists today, we at Skyscanner are first and foremost passionate travellers, and we understand firsthand that navigating the world of travel right now is pretty complex, and there's less confidence now than there's perhaps ever been. Whether you've booked a trip, or if you're planning to book a trip, or you're just curious about what the travel experience is like right now, as we come to terms with how COVID has affected the world of travel, we want to support our travellers and provide practical information. Along with the organisations that our panellists today represent, here at Skyscanner, we're trying to do that for all of our travellers with new features we've launched into our products and services, some of which you might hear about today. And we hope that you all find today informative and enjoyable, and that we help build you towards being travel confident. Our panelists today are key leaders from across the industry, and they're here to give us a full overview of the travel situation at the moment for when you're ready to travel or need to travel next, so that when you do, you know what's what and potentially have a little more confidence. The format of our discussion today is loosely going to focus on the key stages of a trip. So that's planning, the experience at the airport, the plane journey itself, and then the experience in the hotel and at your destination. We know we don't have all the answers, I'm not sure anyone does, but we hope that sharing our thoughts and experiences of our thoughts at the moment will help you. As we go through, we'd invite you to add any questions to the Slido link that we've set up that would have been on screen for you earlier. And that will appear as a Q&A session later on, just from about 1:50 onwards. You can add your own questions to that, either in response to what's been said, or else feel free to introduce new topics. And you can also upvote questions that are already there, so the ones with the highest number of votes are the ones that we'll get to first. We'll also be asking a few questions via a poll on Zoom, so please don't be too surprised when you see a pop-up asking you some questions about the travel that you plan to take. You can get rid of the pop-up by answering the question or by clicking close. And speaking of Zoom, we'd of course love to be together in person having this conversation today, but unfortunately we can't be. We're really hopeful that there won't be any technical issues, but if there are, please stick with us and we'll sort them out just as soon as we can. So turning our attention to our panelists, joining us today are Pete Burns, Director of Marketing and Digital at Heathrow Airport, Michael Levie, Chief Operations Officer at Citizen M Hotels, Uwern Jong, Experientialist in Chief of OutThere Magazine, Tom Hall, representing Lonely Planet, and our own Jess Castilian, Lifecycle Manager at Skyscanner. It'd be lovely if each of you could really introduce yourself nice and quickly, and we'll make up for some lost time. Tell us who you are, what your role is, and perhaps tell us quickly about the next trip that you're planning to take. I'll turn to Jess first.
Awesome, thanks, Martin. So I'm Jess Castilian, so I work at Skyscanner as Global Lifecycle Marketing Manager. So what we really focus on in the team is sharing information with travelers, so in a manner that is timely and relevant for them. We help support them with their travel plans, whether that's looking for a flight, so sending price alerts with that, or booking a hotel or car hire. So yeah, upcoming trips for me that are planned. I'm hoping to travel to Greece soon, so I'm really excited about this whole travel confident mission, and hopefully we can get our travelers excited with us.
That's great, thanks Jess. I'll come to Tom next.
Hello everyone, I'm Tom Hall. I'm a contributor and a writer for Lonely Planet, and I've got, I suppose, over 20 years experience at Lonely Planet and other outlets, putting travel content together and really trying to place travellers at the heart of everything that we do. Of course, I'm a very keen traveller myself. I'm just back from Italy and Austria. I spent summer travelling with my family, and I'm planning to go to Scandinavia early next month. So keeping a close eye on all the restrictions and also trying to make that experience as smooth as possible. So I hope it can be helpful today.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'll come to you, Uwern, next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Martin, for having me, and thank you, Skyscanner, for putting on this fantastic event. My name is Uwern Jong. I am Experientialist-in-Chief. That's just a fancy way of saying Editor-in-Chief at OutThere Magazine. We are the world's leading luxury and experiential travel magazine for LGBT people and their friends. I have had the pleasure of traveling to Iceland, somewhere that I've always wanted to be into over the last couple of months. And upcoming travels, I am also looking to go to Greece, Jess, hopefully maybe at the same time. And I'm also taking a little tour of the northern UK, going up into the Lake District, Scotland, back down into York before coming back to London. So discovering a little bit of my own country.
Great, thank you. I'll come to Michael next.
Hi, my name is Michael Levie. I run the operational side of Citizen M. We're an owner-operator, so we have a development side and an operational. I run the operational side. Have been traveling this summer in Europe mostly. We're opening up a hotel. Actually, it opened yesterday in Geneva. We're opening up in Washington next week. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there for that whole process, and I've done that through Zoom. So yes, travel, but not all the travel that I had hoped for.
Thanks, Michael. And I'll come to you last but not least, Pete.
Thanks, Martin. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Pete, so I look after marketing digital at Heathrow Airport. You hopefully all know Heathrow and have travelled through. If you haven't, there's an ITV series that's been running over the last 3 weeks. So do have a look at that. Have a look at it on Catch Up. You can find out what it's like at the airport. But yeah, our vision has always been to give passengers the best airport service in the world, and that is even more so the case post-COVID. So very happy to share what we're planning to do around that to keep everyone safe. And next place to travel, probably because I want to get out of lockdown and into the outdoors. I'd love to go to the wilds of Canada. It's the one country I haven't been to, so that's next on my list.
That's great. Thanks very much, everyone. So you'll have seen that the poll has just appeared on your screen, hopefully, with the results. So you can see, as well as our panelists, that there's a lot of people thinking about traveling in the sort of, well, fairly soon, but you can definitely see a kind of spread of results there with some people really not quite confident yet or still feeling that travel's a long way away for them. So I think if we now just kind of move into the planning stage of things, as we say, it's clear that people are very much thinking about it, but you know, I think the experience of planning a trip is really important, but that's changed a lot at the minute. There's a lot of new information, there's a lot of new considerations in the kind of post-COVID world. So I think I'll come to you first, Tom. You're representing Lonely Planet. You know, you're used to inspiring people to take trips. What do you think is really important for people to think about in the planning phase at the minute? Are there any kind of key tips you would give to our listeners today?
I think the key word is short, probably short haul, short-term planning, and maybe even short trips. So if people are thinking about going somewhere, certainly travellers that I've spoken to, you know, whether they're people who are contacting us or indeed friends and family, there is a huge appetite to get away. I think the results of the poll, they show that. But there's quite a bit of nervousness as well, and that's understandable. You know, it's great that the theme of this webinar is about confidence, and I think confidence is something that we in the industry have got to do everything that we can to build, and there's good reason to have it. But what I would say is that while there are things to be nervous about, there's also things to be optimistic about. And I think there are very good experiences that are out there at the moment, whether that's booking a flight, booking a hotel, making any sort of travel arrangements. There's far more flexibility around those arrangements than I think we've probably ever had before. That's to the benefit of travellers who are prepared to take the plunge. There's also loads and loads of information out there, whether it's on companies' own websites or whether it's in travel media sites. We see, and you know, I'm sure Uwern and anyone who's in the business of travel content will see, is a huge appetite for information. But there is also a lot out there after a sort of an initial lag. I think there's far more in the way of knowledge and information. The other thing that I would say is just to look very closely at what it is that you're actually agreeing to and signing up to. So while there is information and there is flexibility, things like travel vouchers, they can come with some conditions. You know, I loved the experience that I had of using my British Airways vouchers. I got them and I used them. I found that a great experience. But it is also important to note that if you had a flight, your flight gets cancelled or it gets moved, and you then take those vouchers. In many circumstances, you could be forfeiting the right to an actual cash refund if you don't take it at that point. So it's just little things like that to have a good look around. But planning, and then when you do go, thinking, all right, I'm probably not going to go too far from home. One reason is that you can't, and another reason is that it means that you can be flexible if plans need to change. And I think lastly, not going for too long for the same reasons.
That's great, Tom. Uwern, I'll come to you next. I think, you know, you're an avid traveller. You know, how have things changed for you in terms of planning trips?
Well, not very much, actually. I'm an eternal optimist, so maybe that's why not very much has changed. But I've continued to dream big right from the very start when travel came to a pause. And some 6 months later, I'm still dreaming big. That hasn't really changed. That's always come naturally to me, and it reflects the ethos we have out there. I'm still inspired by researching and discovering gorgeous hidden gems, cultural gems, for the experiential side of what we do, and also sublime escapist hotels on the luxury side, even if there are still restrictions in place. Because beyond booking your next trip, I really feel that feeding your wanderlust is really important for positive mental health. You know, travel and dreaming big is so powerful in that way, and it has been the thrust behind our own Keep Your Mind Traveling campaign over the last 6 months. But I've personally been looking up more of the more sort of transformative experiences in travel that echoes the results of our reader survey. This time has made me really kind of reevaluate what I look for in my storytelling, but also in my own leisure time, with everything that's happening other than the dreaded C word, COVID. You know, there are things like conservation and sustainability initiatives that was once dependent on the travel industry that is in serious jeopardy. And things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the shifting politics in certain parts of the world to the far conservative. I'm keen to get out into parts of the world that will change my perspectives on it, and to understand the impact of, say, British colonialism on the Commonwealth countries, for example, or that the Caribbean has a more deep and disturbing history beyond its beautiful white sand beaches, and how it's important for us to get out and support safaris and other conservation-based tourism as soon as we can. In terms of who I'm inspired by, it's the expert storytellers, editors, journalists, bloggers, those who have voiced strong opinions, and really understand the world of travel, because they know the ins and outs of the travel industry and they have their finger on the pulse. I'm part of that community, so is Tom, but my peers are also my barometers as to what's happening in travel. And I think coming out of this, we'll all be much better at filtering out the clutter, and we'll understand that tried and tested expert opinion is much more important than gratuitous Instagram pictures. And in terms of planning, I have 2 hot tips that have served me quite well when I started to travel again. First is to consider previously crowded or over-touristed destinations, places like Venice or Rome. Despite the increase in demand, they are quieter at this time of year, and culturalists among us can enjoy these places away from the usual crowds. The second is to consider what you would perceive rightly or wrongly as more expensive destinations, Nordic destinations like Iceland, where I went to recently, or certain Greek islands, or the Amalfi Coast in Italy, for instance. Flights are more affordable than ever before, and hoteliers are discounting as an incentive to returning guests. So even the best restaurants are doing great deals to woo foodies back in. In terms of preparing for the trip, being a publication that champions diversity in travel, particularly for the LGBT+ community, I've always been more fastidious when it comes to the details and the research. So get under the skin of a destination or accommodation before committing. Understand how suited they are for you. So beyond the fabulous, revel in the detail. And that's naturally heightened in this time, especially when health and safety factors come into play. And with the uncertainty, what I've been doing is gathering a bucket list of destinations rather than just one, so I can turn on and off based on government advice. Also look to book with a reputable company. beyond what is the lowest price. So when I'm on Skyscanner, for example, I'm not just going for who is the cheapest, but looking at the companies listed and their reputation based on others or who have traveled with them before I book, what their refund or change policies are, if they're bonded, and how easy it is to access helpful customer services.
I think that's a really good point, and I think the trust in the planning and booking processes is really important at the moment. I think coming to you, Michael, do you feel that those are things that as well as the overall trip booking and flight aspects of things, how would you say that accords with the hotel booking process and planning?
Yeah, I think that what we have witnessed is that those areas that had travel restrictions in place immediately had an impact, of course, on our occupancy. Although short trips and short stays and short distances to get to there, so staycations definitely had a pickup. We just see that the severity of the pandemic in particular locations has a direct impact on the recovery of occupancy in our hotels. I do believe that we also have learned a lot as traveling public over the past couple of months, because when this all started, it was for us all very uncertain and unsure what were the impacts, where was it coming from. And as unfortunately this pandemic unfolds, we start to understand more and more what the risks are, what we can do to be more careful, who are most at risk. And as such, the sort of actions that travelers themselves take, and also how they view those establishments or airlines or restaurants that they frequent, how they are taking this pandemic seriously and are really making sure that the utmost is done in order to prevent any risk. So by and large, it's still early in the recovery, but we do see that in those countries where the pandemic is, let's say, more or less under control, we see a recovery. It started in the East. It allowed us to prepare a little bit. We had our Shanghai hotel and Taipei hotel in Taiwan, of course, give us an early warning so we could prepare and adjust for that in Europe and the US. But I do believe we also see now that the recovery is taking place there. And if there are little spikes, that the governments react stricter, but shorter, and do not derail the economy necessarily as much as unfortunately was necessary during the lockdown.
Yep. Thanks for that, Michael. So I mean, I think a lot of information there, I think, for people who are listening today. I think one of the key standout things for me is something which Tom said, actually, which was to do with the almost checking the terms and conditions, checking the detail, and keeping up to date with information like that. Now, I suppose moving on to the airport element of your trip, through the planning and booking process, as well as the actual logistics of arriving at the airport is a really key thing there. So I think coming to you next, Pete, in terms of what's the experience like at the airport for people at the minute? Can you tell us what sort of measures are in place at Heathrow, what sort of changes you've had to make?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing is, and I've been in the terminals quite a lot recently in Terminal 5. You'll actually, there are changes you will notice, but actually it does feel very normal. And I think that the point about planning is, you can find that information relatively simply, and some of the measures we put in place is very much around safety, and safety and security is something that's part of what we do. And so you'll see a number of measures put in place. So that will include the wearing of face masks, increased sanitization, the 600 hand sanitizer pit stop, so to speak, through the airport. You'll see the use of social distances. We've got robots running around the airport using ultraviolet light to keep things clean. And you'll also see an increase in the use of digital services. So digital check-in through airlines. We have a digital service in the airport where you can pre-order your food and then pick it up. So it's more of a contactless contactless experience, and also contactless retail, so you can pre-order and click and collect. And so certainly my experience when I've been going through the airport is actually, once you understand those changes, which are really important, but in terms of your journey are actually relatively light impact, it feels really normal. When you go through to the departures lounge, you'll see most of our shops and food and beverage outlets are open, so you can go and purchase something, you go and sit, you can play on the Wi-Fi, and then you can go to your gate. So safety is really important. We put in a lot of measures, but actually my personal experience is, once I got over wearing the mask and getting used to wearing that, I mean, my most practical piece of advice was actually just make sure you've got a mask that fits your head and doesn't hurt your ears, because actually once you've got over that, the process itself is quite straightforward and feels very normal.
Great. I think that's really good to know. I suppose there's going to be different measures in place at different airports as well, though. So coming to Jess for a second, what are travel organisations doing to try and communicate the different measures and different experiences in place at airports to travellers?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's going to be different based on what country you're traveling to, where you're traveling from, and through what airport. So something that we've done at Skyscanner is try to, kind of give that flexibility of information to our travelers. So for example, through our Where is Open map, where travelers can actually go and find out where they can go for themselves, but also know what to expect when they get to the airport. For example, do you have to take a COVID test when you get to the airport? Are you going to need to quarantine actually when you get to that country? And just all about providing that information so that they have an expectation about what that trip is going to be like through the airport and for their general travel.
And coming back to Pete for a second, curiosity question for me, but is the experience at the airport likely to change much depending on where you're flying to or who you're flying with?
So I think with the within the individual airport, Heathrow, each of the airports is different. I think the key question, this comes to your point around planning, Martin, is actually where you're going to, and then fundamentally what the government or quarantine restrictions are. So as part of your planning, you absolutely should just have a think about the different stages of your journey. And if you are going to an airport or a country that may have different regulations, just be clear on what they are and have a contingency plan if quarantine does come into force. You'll find, for example, one of the things we are doing at the moment is testing. So we have a testing facility. It's not live at the moment. It's something we're lobbying the government about, but that's something we're trying to get an international standard on. So as a passenger, as you go through lots of different airports, you will have the same standard you have as when you go through security or when you get on an aircraft. So I would advise checking with the individual country or airport that you're traveling to, but certainly Heathrow, we are working a lot with the government to try and create an international standard, which will make it easier for passengers no matter where they're traveling to.
That's good to know. You've obviously recently travelled to Iceland, and I'm sure other places as well. And I think be interesting to hear what your experience of travelling through the airport was like. And I think as well, you've also had to be subject to a COVID test. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Well, as Pete says, yeah, it was actually relatively normal, surprisingly so, with obviously, added security and safety measures in place. So traveling out was great through airport to Terminal 5 on BA. I traveled to Iceland in July. It was a month after the country reopened with measures to test all travelers on arrival, which I think is a great thing and something we really need to pick up on here in the UK on return. And I gave them a chance to trial their track and trace system for a month before committing. So I booked my flights on Skyscanner, actually. That's not a plug, I actually did. And it was amazing value for the destination. So what I was saying earlier, a destination like Iceland is usually quite an expensive destination, but it was just £90 out. Return on, out on BA, return on EasyJet. And the first and most important thing, I had to ensure that I had no symptoms. Even if I had a sniffle, I was to question whether or not I was fit to travel. That was my responsibility to my fellow travelers. And I think that's really important. People heed that advice. And all I had to do was head to the country's new website for pre-registration for visiting Iceland. It was a simple procedure, like submitting an ESTA for travel to the US, declare that I was symptom-free for 48 hours. And the rest of the form was pretty straightforward. And it was all based on your mobile phone number. You had to download the app to make sure they could track and trace you once you were in the country. And then you were faced with a choice. I could travel or quarantine in Iceland for 14 days, which just made no sense. Or I could pay to have the test on arrival. It was just about £50. to do that, and if you wanted to pay up front. And while I had no trepidation about the trip, this whole process made me even more confident about how Iceland was dealing with the disease. On British Airways, London Heathrow to Iceland's Keflavik went very smoothly. Contactless services in the lounge, socially distant seating on board, complete with a snack pack that I wouldn't have received in normal times too. And the aircraft wasn't fully loaded. It was interesting to see that even with confident COVID-19 spread prevention measures in place for Iceland, travelers were not flocking to the destination. You know, Iceland receives usually about 40,000 arrivals a day, including transit passengers, with around 30% entering the country. Post-COVID, this average fell to 1,500 entries. So they need your trade. They need you to come in. But on arrival, we're told to wait our seats. Our row was called. It was all very civilized. Everyone, you know, deplaned very easily. You had a QR code on your phone. You zapped the code, and then you went through to the testing booth. Very much like you would go through security as you were going, you know, if you were departing. The test itself, now people have asked me a lot of questions about the test itself. It's actually really relatively simple. It's over in 3 minutes. So you enter a booth, a private booth, it's all screened off, and you get 2 swabs. The first swab is in your mouth. A swab, by the way, if you don't know what that is a long, super long cotton bud. You imagine that, yeah? The first one goes into your mouth, it goes around, it comes out, that's fine. Now, what happens with the second one, it goes up your nose, and that is a tiny little bit uncomfortable, but not horrible. The lady in front of me set me off because she started yelping when this Q-tip went up her nose. So I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a horrible process. And it wasn't at all. It was over in 2 seconds. They were super friendly. They told you what to do, reminded us to download the app again so they could trace where we were. And then what you had to do was go and shelter. Well, although the regulations aren't actually that strict, just use your common sense, try to keep away from people, and shelter until your results come. And the results with me, on average, it should take about 2 to 4 hours. Mine took a little longer because it was the day that Iceland was changing their processes, but it was relatively straightforward. And you know what that meant was that I could travel across the country, no mask, right? Safe in the knowledge that I'm protecting myself, I'm protecting locals and residents around me, other travelers, and those in hospitality. And that's a fantastic way to travel, considering the time.
I mean, it's really great to hear about the experience, because I know that it's something that people hear a lot about, and want to hear that first-hand experience of what it was like. I suppose moving from the airport into the plane, and the experience of travel. Tom, I think you mentioned you'd recently been traveling in Italy. I know some of it was by train, but how did you find the experience of traveling with your family? And I guess traveling in this kind of new environment, what was that like for you?
I'd given, I suppose, what I do for a living, I'd read quite a lot about people's experiences of getting on planes in this sort of, immediate post-COVID environment, use of masks, increased sanitation, etc. There are a couple of things that I would say were really quite pleasant surprises. The first one was the boarding procedure, which was by most measures, I think, a much better way to get on and to get everybody on a plane than the system that everybody would be very familiar with of first and business class board first and then other classes, etc., or indeed some sort of speedy boarding or other procedures like that. It was very clear. It was anyone who needed assistance first, as you'd expect, and then you board from the back. But then, very interestingly, when you arrived, everyone would get off the plane from the front, and so everybody knew that they just took their time and waited, and there just wasn't the same sense of real urgency and impatience that you get. I think that was good for everyone. It was good for the crew, it was good for passengers, it was good for people traveling with kids, just good for everyone. Everybody knew where they stood. Yes, everybody had to keep their masks on. Our flights were into Venice and out of Vienna, Austria. So it was a 1.5 hour, 2 hour flight at either end. That was, as you'd expect. At times it felt like quite a long time, but you could take it off to have a quick drink of water or a quick bite of something to eat and then put your mask back on. But there's also a sense of everyone being in the same boat. And I think that was very important. Everybody's in it together. The cabin crew are very you know, I found it very, very good at communicating clearly what needed to happen and what was going to happen. But also, I think there was a sense of optimism, just the act of being on a plane and going somewhere interesting, going somewhere different after those long months of lockdown. Everybody was quite excited to do it. The other surprise was that there wasn't spacing on the flight per se. You know, both flights were largely full. I was sitting next to a total stranger on each flight. I hadn't really thought about that, and if I'd have looked into it, I don't think it would have given me any concerns, but it's worth people knowing a little bit about that in advance. And just as a very brief aside, you know, traveling by train varies a lot in Europe, country to country. We were on a night train from Venice to Vienna. It was a wonderful experience. Our family are off. We put them on when we were moving around the train, but the whole thing was, you know, really, really fantastic. So I would say it was actually more enjoyable flying than it normally is.
Well, that's definitely a positive thing to hear. I suppose you know, the experience might be different airline to airline. So coming to you, Jess, quickly, you know, I think Skyscanner is trying to provide a bit of information, aren't they, to travellers around what the different experience might be like on different planes.
Yeah, exactly. So in addition to, you know, the articles and informational resources that we push out to travelers, we also launched the airline safety rating, which is a new feature when you're browsing flights on the Skyscanner website. So basically now travelers have the option to search for and choose an airline based on that safety rating. And what makes up those ratings is basically what health and safety measures are taken by the airline, so that you can know what to expect when you're flying, but then also what's expected of you and what you need to bring to the table as well when you're flying. So basically there are the 5 different criteria that make up the score. So it'll let you know if that particular airline requires you to wear a face mask, for example, if they deep clean the plane on a daily basis, if you receive a sanitation pack, or if the crew are wearing PPE, but also things that people want to know that they're used to, like the food service, right? Are you gonna get it or not? And those are criteria that are listed out for you to know based on that airline. So yeah, again, giving that flexibility for people to have that information to choose how they want to travel and make that planning process a bit easier.
That's great. And coming to Pete for a quick second, you know, have you spent a lot of time working with different airlines around measures, and you know, are you seeing a lot of collaboration at all between airlines on things like this for consistency, or is it all pretty different?
So we are working towards that. I think it depends on the airline. I think, as we know, a number of airlines have been impacted in terms of passenger volume. So many of them, their focus has been on restarting their business and coming up with a new safe proposition for customers. But absolutely, from an operational point of view, you'll see that. I think one of the things which is really interesting, and you mentioned insurance earlier, is that we're starting to see a number of airlines now offering COVID insurance as part of their offer. So Virgin Atlantic offer it, Emirates offer it, and I think that's a great step forward, because it gives you confidence as a passenger to fly, and you know, with brands like that they'll be providing an insurance that you can support with. So not so much consistency across airlines, but the measures that they're putting in place, whether that's safety, whether that's reassurance or flexibility, is generally consistent.
That's good to hear as well. I suppose, you know, moving from the kind of aviation aspects of this to what's happening when you actually arrive at your destination. So in terms of your hotel and the experience in the resort or wherever you happen to be, you know, coming to Michael, you know, what's your thoughts on that? Do you think there's much of a consistency between the approach that different accommodation providers have taken?
Well, it's very difficult because there's no rating or ranking system on hygiene or cleanliness. We never gave it 2 thoughts prior to this whole pandemic. So we know that the star rating level will give us luxury, and we assume that with that luxury everything comes along. But as in everything, there are people that really take things to heart and do it full-heartedly because they have that as their belief and their as mantra. And there's those that just do it because you have to. So cleanliness is one of those that you know, you need to spend time, money, and detail in order to get it accomplished. And I think that there are giveaways for the guests to see whether it is taken seriously. So those hotels that provide you with clear new house rules and that clearly give you an option to use an app and do everything electronically and hands-free. They think with you in order to make sure that the space that you have taken for a couple of days has become really yours, and that you can operate everything, including opening the door, besides checking in and out on an app. And it sort of tells you a story about how serious they take cleanliness. Not everybody has an app. Not everybody, is in the position at the various rankings of hotels to do that. So I think that it is important prior to your travel to find out indeed how serious the hotels take that. For Citizen M, we have taken our measures right off the bat because we do believe that if a guest at night switches off the light and closes their eyes, they sort of assume that they're safe and that we have taken care of everything, and we take that trust and confidence very seriously. So also in hygiene and taking care of cleanliness, this is something that we need to ensure. It's our responsibility, not only guest facing in front of the house, but equally in the back of the house. We have even taken steps whereby we have teamed our crew, our teams or our employees together on shift, so there was no possibility of cross-contamination. We have put one part of the teams at home, if you wish, on the bench. So if there was any issue or any remote opportunity for contamination, we would be able to get the team off the bench and activate them. And so, yeah, it's a philosophy, it's a drive. I think that it is important that the guests participate themselves also in that process, right? Because it's a two-way street.
Totally. And, I think something that, has been a theme for a lot of conversations around the response to COVID, but I'm thinking particularly of something Pete said earlier about robots going through Heathrow with UV light, which I'd like to hear more about at some point because I find that very intriguing. But do you feel, Michael, that technology has been a key thing in terms of helping accommodation providers cope with the challenges of COVID?
Technology can be. I think that the hotel industry is not known for its most advanced technology. So we have always a little bit of a problem and are lagging behind. We were fortunate enough in the position with our technology to immediately roll out or fast track our app, and touchless has become an ability. So you can make your reservation, check in, open your room, all touchless with us. And in all our rooms, we have normally an iPad to still have that can operate basically all the functionality of your room. Now that's available on your app as well. So basically you can feel comfortable without touching anything. And then of course there's the opportunity right now that we encourage guests to take possession of their room, and it is your room for the duration of the stay. We will not go in unless you ask us to. So it's more setting the stage, and we were fortunate to be able to offer it relatively quickly when the pandemic started to our guests. But I think that technology is an opportunity, but unfortunately in our industry, difficult to roll out. And if then it is sporadic hotels within a chain that do participate, but it's never, the entire chain. So we're a little bit of an exception, I guess, in that.
And I suppose, it's a fair comment that, not every industry is able to adapt to new technology as quickly as others. Jess, coming to you for Skyscanner, we're in the travel technology business. In theory, it should be nice and easy for us to do that, but I'm sure that's not the case. But what sort of information are we seeing our travelers looking for, and what are we doing to try and provide that information to them around the experience in hotels and in destinations?
Yeah, so I think there are two main pillars that are kind of the theme of all this, right? Which is on one side, flexibility so that you can plan and know what to expect, and on the other, health and safety. And when it comes to hotels, for the health and safety aspect, it's again, you know, a lot of stuff that's already been talked about is cleanliness. So what we've tried to surface is a cleanliness score, which is based on ratings by travelers, so that when you're looking at the different hotels, you can feel confident and have that security that you know you're going into a place that is clean, that is abiding by guidelines. And in terms of that flexibility, there's also another filter which we've added into that search as well, so that you can start seeing, you know, what free cancellation policies are out there for which hotels, and make those informed choices going forward. So we've definitely added that into the technology perspective as well, to take into account.
And, you know, thinking about the broader impact on what it's like to go somewhere and what the experience is actually like, you know, I imagine that for a number of travelers, you know, they can understand what it's like to, you know, book the flight, book their hotel, you know, and go through the logistics of that process. But it's maybe a bit of an unknown for people what it's actually going to be like when they get there. So coming to you know, to Tom, you know, obviously you're just back from your trip to Italy. You know, do you feel that, you know, is there any advice you would give to people? What was your experience like?
One thing that I would say, I'd sort of echo something that Michael said about visiting somewhere being a two-way street, and almost about this contract between, you know, a hotel and a guest, or probably more fundamentally than that, a destination and a guest. One thing that I really took from being in both Venice and Vienna was a sense that one thing that visitors really need to do is to be seen to be really visibly going the extra mile to comply with the requirements for everybody who's there, whether it's about masks or you know, or any other type of behaviour. That feels to me like a new condition of being a good guest in places. And I think as we look into the future, you know, really being considerate about behaviour is in this new way is just going to be not something that people can do, but something that people really have to do. Going beyond that, you know, what was remarkable, I think, and this maybe comes a little bit back to what Uwern was talking about with choosing a destination that gets quite a lot of visitors. What a golden time it was to be in Venice, and I think it will continue to be. For, you know, people have time on this one. The clock is not ticking in a matter of weeks. This is going to be quite some time, really. It's going to be quite a while before we see large numbers of people arriving in Venice in the way that there have been in the past. You know, there was a debate about cruise ships anyway, but you know, just large groups of people, for instance, from the US. It's going to be several months really before we start to see anything like that returning, and that means that some of the experiences that we had, which were completely unforgettable, walking into somewhere like St. Mark's Square, normally with hundreds, if not thousands of tourists there, and finding that there were probably less than 36 people there, and that there was all room to enjoy it. You got a sense of really what you know, a local's experience of being in Venice could be like, and you know, possibly should be like. And so that was a very special thing, and I felt very privileged to have experienced that. The other thing was that it was fascinating to get a different take on normal life, and that's really what we experienced in Vienna in Austria. You know, we were staying in an apartment in a suburb of Vienna, so we saw how they had adapted their everyday life and routines. We were able to do a little bit of comparing to the situation in the UK, and we were quite inspired by what we found, really. So I think that you know, in terms of being in some of these places, it really encouraged me to want to do more travel, not just at the moment, but over the next few months. And you know, the first time we do anything in this situation, it can feel a little strange, but really I think, you know, maybe after that first trip, our experience was not, oh, that's satiated our wish to travel. It just completely fueled it for the future.
That's really interesting to hear. I suppose maybe at this point, because I'm conscious we've got lots of questions mounting up on Slido, which is excellent. So be interesting just to hear really quickly from each of our panelists. So I'll take this as your contribution to that, Tom. What you think the next little while is going to look like for COVID? You know, what do you expect to see emerging? So in, you know, kind of 30 seconds, I'm going to come to each of you. So I'm going to come to you, Uwern, first.
Well, I said transformative travel. People are looking for things that change their world perceptions and a different way of traveling. But also we're going to be seeing a growing trend in nomadic travel, so longer term stays. And we've seen that a lot in our research. Over the past few months, people have realized they can successfully work remotely from anywhere. And with many businesses here in the UK not expecting their workforce to return to the office until a little bit later on. So particularly for our audience, which is the LGBT traveler, with less physical ties, less children, the barrier of quarantine is no longer an issue for travelers looking at to get out into warmer climes, particularly as winter hits. So I kind of see people taking longer breaks over the next few months, if they can. Obviously there's the luxury of time there, but if you can, go out into the world, experience the world, go to warmer climes, and maybe work from there.
Great, inspirational stuff. I would flag that another poll is probably about to appear on your screen in a second. Oh, there we go. I am going to come to Pete next for your thoughts on trends and what's coming next.
Yeah, sure. So totally agree with all of that. There's real demand for travel. People just need to feel safe and confident. Just two ads, really. I think from an experience point of view, we will see more testing. We'll see that more standardized, and that will get us out of this kind of quarantine roulette we're in, which will encourage more people to travel. And then something we've touched on before, and perhaps no great surprise, there'll be an increase in the digitization of the experience and the end-to-end journey. So whether that's you're booking on the Skyscanner app, or you're using apps through the airport or hotel or retail journey, that will allow you to plan ahead. It will give you the information you need. And often if you've got information, you've got reassurance and you'll feel more confident about traveling. So testing and digital, sort of two key trends we'll see more of.
Great. To you next, Michael, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that, thank God we have a short memory. So travel will come back, and we will do that in force. What's the impact of COVID? I think, as mentioned, digital is definitely something that will change. I don't think it will diminish or take down travel, but it will change travel somewhat and the need of it. And I think another thing that we have seen that the environment, usually there were a few that really were concerned with the environment and the rest dismissed it. I think that everybody has seen the impact of COVID and now positively on the environment. And everybody is convinced we got to do something about that. So that will be another influence that is here to stay, and requirements will be more stringent on companies to live up to preserving the environment.
That's a really great point. Okay, and last in terms of thoughts on trends, over to you, Jess.
Yeah, I kind of want to echo what's already been said here, but I totally agree that I think we're going to see pretty soon people traveling a lot more frequently as they get more information and get more confident with that. But I'm also a strong believer that everyone adapts at their own pace, right? But ultimately, humans love connection, and travel kind of provides that. So I think as long as we keep giving that information and keep letting people know what they can do to travel safely, people will just find a new way to travel, and we'll just do that more steady going forward.
Great, thank you. And I know I said I'd already take your last thing as your contribution to that, Tom, but is there anything, having heard that you want to add?
I think that, just the doubling down on things that we were seeing before the COVID situation came along. We have seen all over the place that coronavirus has been a bit of an accelerator of existing trends. And I think after a small blip, people's concerns about traveling in as ethical and responsible a way as possible is just going to come steaming back. And I think the emphasis on how that goes down to really benefiting communities is going to be something that, was and will be a huge part of the travel experience going forward.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think just in kind of, summarizing some of the things that have been said there, probably in some sort of reverse order, I think that the impact on sustainable travel, definitely the appetite for that hasn't gone away. It remains Skyscanner's mission to lead the global transformation to modern and sustainable travel. And, I think that, that it's really pleasing to see that the reaction to COVID has not been for those aspects of things to disappear. But it's been really great hearing from each of you in terms of your different experiences, and I think there's been a fair amount of practical information that I hope people will have taken some comfort from around what the experience is like to kind of book and plan and actually go on a trip at the minute. But I'm sure there are still some questions that we have not yet answered. So with that, I will hand us through to our Slido, and we'll start going through the Q&A on that front. So if I could ask my colleague to share the Slido screen. Which hopefully will appear in a second. So the format as we're going through this, I'll read the question out, and then I will try and direct it to who I think is most likely to want to answer that question on the panel. But if I don't come to you, because I won't be able to come to everyone for each question, then please jump in. So don't feel free to, make a point if you really want to make it. So coming to the first question from Peter, what would be the best steps? What would be the best steps a tourist who has fallen ill with the virus to take? Should they try to return home immediately or be treated in the foreign country? So I'm going to come to Pete first with that.
Sorry about that. Yes, so just removed my mute. Still haven't got used to the mute after all this time. So I think in many respects it depends on the advice within the government. So if you're entering the country and you're identified as having coronavirus or you're ill, they may not let you into the country and you'll have no chance and you have to come back. If you are within the country, then it depends on the individual requirements. So in most instances, you will be probably encouraged to come back to your original country, or you may be asked to self-quarantine in that country until you're no longer a risk. So it's a case-by-case basis, and that's one of the other reasons we need international standards. But the key thing is you'll probably be asked to quarantine until you're no longer a risk to anybody else by travelling back to your home country.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to move on to the next question now. So from Peter, do you consider staying at hostels safe at a time of a pandemic? So I'm going to come to Uwern first for an answer on this, and then I'm going to go to Michael.
I haven't stayed in a hostel for a very long time as a luxury travel editor. But it totally depends. I think, it depends what measures has been put in place. Certain hostels will be very good at putting social distancing measures and all the measures I'm sure that Citizen M are doing. Maybe he's better to answer this question. But yeah, absolutely. I don't think the pattern of travel will change at any budget. It depends on each individual travel supplier or travel provider to put in the measures to make sure their guests are safe. So make sure you do your research ahead of time and check with the provider.
Could I come in on that one, please? Is that okay? Just to say that in addition to that, which I think is a very good starting point, lots of hostels are responding by following quite careful country by country guidance. So you would find that dormitories would be having vastly reduced numbers of people, enhanced cleaning procedures, and making sure that communal spaces are thoroughly disinfected or possibly not used in the way that they have been in the past. The good news is that means that sort of affordable alternative, accommodation wise, still exists. The bad news is it's obviously a very different experience, and hostels really thrive on that communal experience, that sense of bonhomie and camaraderie that they offer. However, that experience is, I think we have to be honest at the moment, generally quite lacking when you're traveling anywhere. So people should expect it to be different. One of the things that I've had in conversations with people is a sense that things are going to get back to a sense of normality more slowly in some cases than others. But certainly the right hostels operating in the right way can indeed be safe. But I would also be having a look at a company like Hostel World and their advice, and using the evidence of one's own eyes if you're traveling independently.
Yeah, I think there's one more additional thing to consider. is like on airplanes, the air refresh is constant and filters. And you need to take a look at when you travel at your hotel. Does your room have a direct refresh, meaning that the air conditioning system takes fresh air from outside and not recycled air? And more contemporary systems are set up like that. We build most of our hotels modular, so we always have a per room in and out that is not shared anywhere, and also for the public spaces. So I think that besides knowing social distancing and understanding the number of people, it is also about the refresh of the air that provides safety.
Okay. Coming to the next question from Elizabeth. What are 2 or 3 positive outcomes from the COVID crisis that you see happening for the travel industry? So I'm going to come to Pete first on that.
Yeah, sure. I think what's been a positive, and I'm a like you, a very positive person, is that there's real demand for travel. People want to travel. It showed you the importance of travel, both to individuals and families, but also to the broader economy. And I think what it will also do is perhaps accelerate some of those improvements in the customer experience that Tom mentioned, that were perhaps happening but slower in certain areas. So whether that's digital, whether that's the example of boarding an aircraft, all of those actually will then continue post-COVID, and overall we'll get a better experience when we travel.
I think I'll come to Uwern next for the same question.
I think there'll be a greater appreciation of what travel providers do in general, particularly at this time. I think people have suddenly understand the need of how much caretaking goes into the travel experience, you know, what travel providers supply to customers and their experience. And I think there'll be a heightened understanding. I think we've covered a lot of the positive outcomes. Like Michael said, you know, sustainability it has become key, it's become top of the agenda. People understand the impact of what they do on the environment better, and a sense of greater social caretaking for each other as well. And also, you know, I touched on it earlier, things like conservation. You know, a lot of conservation initiatives, particularly say in safari camps in Africa and stuff, are under a lot of threat. And also just CSR, so corporate social responsibility initiative, whether it's community-based, donations to community-based projects and so on. People will start to realize what travel and travel providers do out in the field to support their local community and their local environment. And I think there'll be just that greater awareness will help us travel the world better when we come back to it.
And Jess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo some of the same things. I mean, not specific to the travel industry, but I would say one thing that really, really stands out in my mind, which we've mentioned before, is the whole sustainability side of things. So I think, you know, it's showcasing a lot of things that travel have already committed to. So, you know, Travelist or any of the other missions that we've set off on in Skyscanner when it comes to sustainability, but also showcasing what we have the opportunity to bring forth to the table even more. And I think COVID has just highlighted all those subjects like sustainability that travelers really, really care about at the end of the day.
Okay. I think I'm going to move on to the next question now. I'm not entirely sure who I'm going to direct this to, but what's the difference between having a medical certificate and a negative PCR test? A lot of South America countries state that as an entry requirement. So if anyone wants to jump in and answer this question, then please do. Looking for anyone coming off mute.
I would,
with you, Pete.
Yeah, I saw this one coming. I'm afraid I don't know the answer, so I'd rather not give incorrect information, because the key thing is the testing procedures and requirements differ by country. So I wonder whether this is one we can take offline and then send to Peter directly.
Yeah, I think unless, you know, I think that's a great illustration of this point that, you know, there's probably a lot of misinformation out there, and the technicalities around some of this is really important. So getting accurate information is key. So yeah, if we could reach out to Peter once we've helped track down the right answer to that question, we'll do that. Okay, I'm going to move on to Neve's question next. is social distancing really possible on planes and in airports? So, I mean, Pete, this one definitely has to go to you first, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sure. I think the answer is very short. So in reality, the answer is no, not always. So where we can social distance, if we take the airport experience with the departures lounge, check-in, the large terminal spaces, we absolutely can. But where it's not possible, Tom talked about his experience sitting next to people on the aircraft. That's why we're using face masks to reduce the risk. So where possible, absolutely. But where it's just not practical, the face mask is the risk mitigation there.
Just, I'll open that up a little bit wider into accommodation as well. So, Michael, you know, do you think it's fairly straightforward for social distancing in hotels?
Well, I think that we all sort of have looked at programming a little bit. So routing and, you know, the use of elevators and obviously with reduced space in our restaurants, we had to come up for breakfast with different solutions. But most hotels, we definitely offer the ability to, you know, have your breakfast dropped off at the room or takeaway. We are very clear on where you can sit and how the social distancing works. And again, like I mentioned before, it's a dance with the guests, right? And they really have figured out what is safe, what is not safe, how to behave. And I think that we have learned a lot as an industry, but also those that travel have learned how to adapt. So it's okay for now.
I'm going to move on to our next question from Owen. What's the best course of action should a country you are in go into lockdown? I'm going to come to Tom with that one.
Well, the only course of action really is the requirements of the country that you're in, and I think this is something that we saw when you know the sort of national lockdowns were taking place, you know, in the springtime of this year. It did catch out quite a lot of people, and there were in some cases limited options that people might have. I think it's important though to also try to look at where exactly we are, you know, with the way that most countries are approaching this situation at the moment. You know, there is far more emphasis on regional solutions. There is far more emphasis on phased measures than the sort of blanket lockdowns that I think all of us had experienced. And that should be something which means that the experience of traveling in places is a far better one, clearly, as we move forward. That said, you know, this is the point at which to understand the flexibility that you have in any bookings that you have made. So, you know, can you change your flights at short notice? You know, can you change the destination so that you can leave if you're in one place and you want to get somewhere else? Are there land-based alternatives that you might be able to use? And indeed, what might the requirements be if you are returning home or traveling to a third country after coming from a country that is in lockdown? So really, the first thing to do is to seek out official advice. The second thing to do is to look at what your travel options are. And the third is to understand the implications of them.
So that's sound advice, I think. You looked slightly excited when I read out that question, so I'm just going to come to you next to see if you had anything to add.
On the best course of action.
Yeah.
I'm totally echo what Tom says. You know, I think it also depends on who you are, what you do. I know there are a lot of people who can't return, who can't quarantine on return because of their jobs. So if you're one of those people, you know, I guess you have to look immediately at how you can return and whether it's within your means. I know. When France went down and Spain went down, you know, my in-laws were actually in France at the time, you know, 24 hours before it came down, and they looked at ways of getting home, and it was very complicated. It was very expensive, and it was very complicated. But because of work, they had to be back. So if you have the opportunity to stay and enjoy yourself in the country, you can do so. But you know, if you need to be back, come back.
Maybe I can add one thing, that I do believe that our governments and their guidelines are to be followed. So there's no discussion. The country you're visiting and when you return home, you need to abide by that. Having said that, there is also an own responsibility. So I think that we, as we travel and make the decision to take the risk when we travel, we also need to take the consequences and make sure that we are safe to others and use our judgment there. So it's not only looking at the government as to regulations. At midnight the lockdown starts. So if I arrive 10 minutes prior, then I don't have to self-quarantine. That doesn't work for me. There's a responsibility that we all carry ourselves as well.
That's a very good point as well. Moving on to the next question from Trevor. Should anybody book a flight through an online travel agent, considering how it makes things more complicated if the flight's cancelled and you need a refund? I'm sure there's probably a range of views on that. I'll come to Jess first.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's obviously been a complicated area and a concern for lots of people. And I would say the best thing to say on this is that there are definitely learnings to take from it, but also that you should be expecting to give a little bit more time for any types of refunds or things to be processed. So obviously the advantage of booking through an OTA is that there is the competitive pricing, which is really useful for lots of people who are trying to travel in these tougher times. But when it does come to the refunds, you should generally wait for the refund to be issued to the OTA first, and then the OTA will be able to issue a refund to yourself. So the whole process does take a little bit longer. So that's worth taking into account when requesting those.
Thanks, Jess.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no.
One last point, obviously, is on the Skyscanner side of things, is I did mention it earlier, but we do have the flexible fares in this situation. So even if you are browsing just your flights, that is something that we do have on our products, and you can filter out for, those flexible policies and policies with an airline or with an OTA or something that you should really look into when you are making any kind of booking or choice that way.
Great, thanks, Jess. Does anyone else want to contribute to that question? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, on to our next question from Hannah. What should travellers consider when planning and booking their next escape? I'm going to come to Pete with that first.
Yeah, just sure. A few practical tips. I know we've talked a lot about that in today's session. Just have a think about each stage of your journey, whether it's the airport, the hotel, the aircraft, just to make sure you understand if there are any changes. And I think from my point of view, we're talking about sort of a normality of travel. Do plan ahead, but don't over plan and over worry about it, because I don't know about you, if I've done trips where I've over planned and it's taken the joy out of going in some respects. So try and get that balance. Understand the latest quarantine rules, make use of digital services if you can. We've talked about insurance. Obviously, make sure you have insurance and just check the details of that. And then I think after that, just go and enjoy yourself. But you just, as long as you're planned, then you know what's happening, you're reassured, and you feel confident in your journey.
Thanks, Pete. I actually think I'd quite like to hear from everyone on this, because I think it's a really good way of kind of rounding up what we've been talking about today, just as we're coming towards the end of our session. So I'll come to Uwern next.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Michael said earlier. Actually, it's your responsibility as the traveler as well. It's not just that the responsibility doesn't just lie in the hand of the hotel or the airport or the airline. Think about it when you travel. When you have to wear a mask, wear a mask. Don't wear it with your nose showing, or don't wear it with your mouth showing. Wear a mask. If 2 meters distance, it means 2 meters distance, not 1.2, not 1 meter, it's 2 meters distance. So think about your responsibility when you want to go out to travel, and how we can make this safe for everyone so that travel can continue. I think that's really important.
Thanks, Uwern. I'll come to Tom next.
I know we've had lots of topics that we've covered. One thing that we haven't really talked too much about is travel insurance. It's boring, but people do need to consider it when they're planning and booking. And just a couple of things: get travel insurance as soon as you can after booking, and if you've got an annual policy, so much the better. But when it comes to COVID, this is very much a moving feast. Insurance companies are still getting to grips with it. Policies are changing all the time. What is covered is changing all the time. And while in a lot of cases, you will now be covered if you get COVID while you're overseas, a lot of related things like disinclination to travel or curtailment in the event of having to come back to avoid a quarantine, for example, may well not be covered, but it does vary hugely. So this is the case where you have to check what you've got. It is also always worth speaking to your insurer, even if it doesn't say that you're covered, just to check whether you may be or not. And also, to try and get, the broadest breadth of cover that you possibly can. So insurance is important. And just one more build on that is an E111 for travel to Europe is still really important for UK nationals for the remainder of this year. And secondly, a lot of things can be done without resorting to travel insurance through your airline, through your hotel, through your tour operator. And they, as I said at the start, they want to be more flexible. So please consider all of that. Sorry for going blah, but I feel it's important.
That's really good information there. Thank you very much for that, Tom. I'm going to come to Jess next, please.
Finding on my unmute button as well. Yeah, I would definitely say it's a combination of really looking at the minutia of it. So, Tom mentioned earlier on looking at the detail of everything. So making sure that you know what the details are for your booking, for your hotel booking, as well as your airline booking. But also allowing yourself a bit of flexibility if you can, and knowing if you go into it knowing that there should be a little bit of flexibility and a day here or there, I feel like you'll have just a lot less of a stressful experience when you go into it. Obviously, not everyone has that freedom. And if you don't, then yeah, resort back to checking all your policies, the policies of your airline, of your hotel. Double check before you get to the hotel if, some of them are open, but only for key workers or specific sets of people. So just look at the fine print.
That's great. Thanks, Jess. And I'm going to come to Michael last, and I'm also just going to sneak in the next Slido question just into this, just if I can, just because it feels like it's fate that's come to you. So as well as your kind of overall roundup there, around what people should consider when planning and booking their next escape, could you also just let us know whether or not you think the hotel services and amenities have been cut as well?
I think that we always prepare for travel, so be more diligent and be aware that the pandemic had a huge impact, and as such you need to do a little bit more homework, and indeed you need to consider that things change daily, hourly, and that might have an impact, so there's a heightened risk. As far as the amenities in the hotels, yes, those are impacted because a lot of amenities or services where there was a heightened risk of cross-contamination obviously are taken out or seized. So that doesn't mean that hotels don't have services anymore, but I give you an example. Most hotel rooms have the room service or the in-room directory. Well, that's one of those things that is very difficult to clean between guest stays. So hotels have resorted to take those out, inform people on check-in that they're available to provide information, or have done this electronically. But it's those type of things that you need to think of. Obviously, services that are affected is where you have multiple people in spaces where simply restrictions won't allow or the risk is too heightened. Think of spas. Think of restaurants. So yes, there is a gigantic impact. So again, there in preparing for your travel, pick up the phone, find out what has changed, and if you can find it online, then usually that means that those companies have thought of providing you that information, and they have put a lot of thought into the whole process. So I would advise you to do that ahead of time.
That's great. Thanks very much, Michael. So I'm conscious we've just run over time. So I think I'll just take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thanks to our amazing panelists. That's been really appreciated. I hope that everyone who's been watching this or listening to this has found it as informative as I have. And I hope that the information that we've discussed and the thoughts that we've shared and experiences that we've talked about will help build a little bit more confidence for people who are watching this in terms of thinking about their next trip. I would say that if you've really enjoyed it and you'd like to watch it again, then it has been recorded and we'll be sharing the link to that afterwards. And for anyone who didn't manage to catch the live showing of this, they'll also be able to watch it. And I'd apologise to people who put questions onto Slido that we haven't managed to get to yet, but we will find answers to those questions and also to the question that we didn't manage to answer properly around the medical certificate, and we will share that in forthcoming content. So with that, I think we'll end, and I'll just say thank you once more to our panelists. Thanks very much.